This is Tamisara here with our last tutorial of this academic year. So we're going to finish off Act 3 today by looking at scene 5 and 6. They're both very short scenes. One is far more important than the other. So as usual, if you haven't already done so, you need to pause at this point and read through the scenes. It won't take you long. They're both very brief. So I will assume that you've done that. And let's get into our analysis. So let's take scene 5 first. What happens in scene 5? It's very simple and very short. The scene is Hecate or Hecate appearing to the three witches, and she tells them off for working with Macbeth without her permission. We're going to talk a little bit about who Hecate is in a minute. So she tells off the witches and then gets herself involved, and she makes plans with the three witches for a meeting with Macbeth the following morning. If you remember in the previous scene, Macbeth finishes off by deciding he's going to go and visit the witches to find out how the story is going to end. And so the witches seem to know that he's on his way, and they make plans for that meeting. And that's all there is to it. The most important thing to say is that it is widely believed that Shakespeare did not write this scene. It's a later addition to the play. And so we've got to treat it very carefully, because we can't build any of our theories about what happens in the play around this scene, because we don't believe it was part of the original play. It's likely that it was added later, possibly even 100 years later, to make the middle section of the play a little bit lighter and more entertaining for the audience. Now, it does reintroduce the witches ahead of their appearance in Act 4, Scene 1, but we've seen in previous scenes that Shakespeare does this already. He has Macbeth talk about the witches and talk about Macduff to reintroduce them for the second half of the play. And so you could argue that this scene isn't really needed for that purpose, but nevertheless, we do see the witches. We also meet Hecate for the first time, and she is going to be appearing in Act 4, Scene 1. So it might have been that people wanted to add a scene where she gets introduced and her role gets introduced. But it does allow, this scene allows for some music and dancing and a little bit of lighter entertainment in that middle section of the play. You could almost see this scene as an interval where the plot doesn't really move on. It's just there for a bit of light relief and entertainment. But please don't think about this in terms of the story arc of the play. Now, who is Hecate or Hecate? She is the Greek goddess of lots of different things. So crossroads, entranceways, night, light, magic, witchcraft, knowledge of herbs and poisonous plants, ghosts, necromancy and sorcery. Now, it makes sense that she is Queen of the Witches, and if you think about our Elizabethan understanding or our Jacobean understanding of witches, Hecate oversees many of those things, so that use of plants for medicinal purposes, witchcraft, magic, and definitely in terms of light and night, and the doorway between good and evil and light and dark is all covered by Hecate's role. And so Shakespeare does seem to have included her as being the sort of manager of our three witches. She was a goddess, and she was the only child of a couple of the Titans, Perseus and Asteria, and she got power over heaven, earth and sea. And so it makes sense that she is involved in the supernatural events of this play. What's really interesting, though, is that when she was pictured in Greek imagery, she was often shown as having three bodies. And so it's interesting that Shakespeare chose to have three witches serving her. We could almost see them as the three aspects of her personality. So let's have a look very quickly at this scene. Now, the first thing we notice is that the first witch notices that Hecate is looking angry, and it's clear that she's unhappy with what the witches have been doing, and she calls the witches disobedient hags. So her language here definitely seems to show that she's really unhappy with these witches. And look at how she speaks to them. How did you dare to trade and traffic with Macbeth? I, the mistress, I was never called to bear my part. And so we get a sense of her power and her authority over the witches, and her annoyance seems to come from the fact that they've acted beyond their role. They've acted on their own initiative without asking permission from her. So we've got this sense of hierarchy amongst these supernatural characters. Now, what we also need to notice is that she mentions Macbeth by name. Now, we haven't seen Hecate and Macbeth speaking to each other, but she does know him by name. And she calls him a wayward son. And so there's this sense that she has got some ownership over him. He's almost like one of her children. So there is some sort of connection between them, but she recognises something about his character. So she says that he's wayward, he sort of willfully does his own thing. And look at the other adjectives that are used. He's spiteful and wrathful. He's an angry man, motivated by anger and revenge, and he loves for his own ends. So she objects to them working with him at all because he just is a really bad character. Perhaps she's being deceptive here, perhaps she's misinterpreted him, but one question we could ask is whether her description of him matches what we've seen of him through Shakespeare's writing in this play. Do you agree that this is what Macbeth is like? I'll leave that up to you. So then she starts planning for this meeting, and it's interesting to note that she knows that Macbeth is on his way, but not only that, she knows why he's coming, that he wants to know his destiny. And so the witches are going to prepare for him, and that tells us that they are up to no good. They are getting things ready to deceive him further. Now, Hecate seems to suggest that their dealings with Macbeth at that meeting are very important. She describes it as great business. And the use of the word wrought here, it's a word that is usually used for crafting. So you get wrought iron that has been crafted and shaped by a blacksmith. You also get a playwright. Now, it's the right part of that word is from this root rather than somebody who writes a play. And this is to do with shaping and moulding in a very deliberate way. And so she's saying here that they have got to do something very particular. They're creating a meeting for Macbeth, and what she mentions next is that they're going to make some sort of potion. And she says that she's going to go off and collect a powerful ingredient, and she talks about a moon drop, if you look here, and that's what she's going to get. Her aim in getting this is to deceive. She says that that ingredient in the potion will raise artificial sprites that will make him have visions, and the intention here is to draw him on to his confusion. So their aim is to cause more chaos. Remember, right at the beginning of the play, they talked about hurly-burly and their aim to confuse and create chaos and disorder. We're going to definitely see that in Act 4, Scene 1. We'll talk about that more when we get there. So their intent is to confuse and deceive Macbeth. And the effect on him is going to be so strong and so powerful that what he learns from the witches is going to cause him to reject wisdom and logic. It's going to make him falsely confident so that he makes really bad decisions. They're going to tell him things that are going to make him believe that he's invincible, and it's going to cause him to behave in an irrational way that doesn't take into account wise counsel, good advice, or logic. And she finishes with this, that confidence or security is the word that she uses. This false sense of security is the greatest enemy of mankind, and we definitely see that playing out. If you notice in the stage directions, there is music and a song, and maybe they dance a little bit and off they go, and that's it. That's the end of the scene. So what's important? First of all, Hecate knows Macbeth by name. Secondly, she hasn't authorised the work that the witches have done, but she's going to bring about Macbeth's downfall anyway, so she is going to get involved at this point. And what's most important is that this scene is probably not Shakespeare's, so we've got to handle it with great caution. What we can see, though, is that it mimics the rhythm and rhyme of the witches' speeches elsewhere in the play. If you look at it carefully, though, it's far less poetic, it's far less creative, and so it seems to be a copy of Shakespeare's style when writing the witches' lines, rather than originally his work. Another important thing to note, though, is that this scene seems to contradict the idea of the tragic hero, because it suggests that the witches are going to bring about Macbeth's downfall. And we know from our study of Greek tragedy and the idea of the tragic hero that it's a personality defect in the character that brings about their downfall. And so we've got to be very careful with how much credit we give the witches for bringing Macbeth down at the end of the play, because I think Shakespeare would want us to believe that it was his own character that caused him, his own hamartia, that fatal flaw of ambition that brings about his very sticky end. Okay, so what do I want you to do? First of all, I want you to complete the scene frame. It's very brief. It's going to be on the next slide. I'll show it to you in a moment. So just note down all of the important details that we've mentioned. And secondly, it would be good for you to build a decent paragraph, an extended paragraph that explains why this scene is unhelpful when we explore the play as a tragedy. So you're looking at the idea of the tragic hero and why this scene doesn't help us think about Macbeth in quite the right way. So there are two activities for you to do, and this is the scene frame. Let's move on. So let's have a look at scene 6. And again, if you haven't already done so, pause the video and just read through the scene. Again, it's very, very brief. So assuming that you've done that, what happens in scene 6? Now, this scene is back at the palace in Forres, and Lennox, who we met in the scene with Banquo's ghost and earlier in the play, he's talking to one of the other Scottish lords at the palace at Forres. So the implication here is that Macbeth has gone back to Dunsinane, which is his home, and that is where the rest of the play takes place. So that makes sense. Now, when Lennox and the Lord are talking, they spend some time reviewing all of the events up to this point. So they mention Duncan's murder, Malcolm and Donalbain running away, Macbeth being crowned king. They mention Banquo's death and Fleance escaping. And so this scene acts as almost like a summary of what's happened up to this point in the play. And they seem to conclude in their conversation that even though Macbeth doesn't appear to have done anything wrong, he's acted properly all the way through. So he's mourned Duncan, he's taken his anger out on Duncan's guards who apparently murdered him. He's suspicious of Fleance, who ran away from Banquo's body. Even though he's played that part quite well, they recognise that he is probably behind it all. And so this scene shows us how much public opinion in Scotland has changed since Duncan's death. And they discuss the state of affairs in Scotland and talk about what it's like to live there with Macbeth as king. And they also talk about Macduff's refusal to attend Macbeth's coronation banquet. So aside from Banquo's death, Macduff boycotting that banquet and refusing to attend seems to be the hot topic in Scotland at this particular moment. And they tell us that Macduff has gone to England to find Malcolm, and that's very significant for what happens in the rest of the play. Okay, so let's have a look through and explore this scene in much closer detail. Lennox is really respectful of Duncan in the way that he speaks. So look at his language here. There are adjectives to describe Duncan, but nothing to describe Macbeth. And actually, as this speech continues, we see his respect for Macbeth diminish more and more. Okay, so he's quite dismissive of Macbeth as king. So Duncan was gracious, Macbeth is nothing. Okay. And there's a sarcastic tone to Lennox's language all the way through this scene. And so he makes a link quite sarcastically between Macbeth's apparent love of Duncan. He says Duncan was pitied of Macbeth. That means Macbeth loved him. And Duncan's sudden death. So he's effectively saying Macbeth loved Duncan, then he was dead. And so there's clearly a tone here that makes the link between Macbeth and Duncan's death. Now, Lennox continues with his sarcastic tone, and it seems that Banquo's murder has been publicly brushed off as his own fault for being out too late at night. Now, what makes this sarcastic is our knowledge that Banquo is a skilled and trained soldier. And so this view that Banquo was unlucky, he was out too late, and that meant that some thugs got him on the road. It seems ridiculous. It's a ridiculous claim because Banquo would easily have been able to look after himself. So this tone tells us that Lennox doesn't believe the accepted story about any of these things. He also sarcastically makes the link between Fleance and Malcolm and Donalbain running away from their father's murders. And he says that people have accepted this belief, or seem to have accepted this belief, that because Fleance ran away, he must have killed Banquo, in the same way that Malcolm and Donalbain running away made them look suspicious. And again, it seems unlikely that Lennox believes this, particularly as we know that Fleance is quite a young boy. Remember back in Act 2, Banquo was teaching Fleance how to carry a sword and how to tell the time using the stars. And so it's unlikely that Fleance would be able to overpower his soldier father and kill him and run away. So there's a total sense of disbelief, incongruity in everything that Lennox is saying here. He uses lots of exclamations here, and it shows a sort of bitterness to his tone. This scene is all really about tone. He's quite bitter in the way that he talks about Macbeth. He also uses rhetorical questions that show his disbelief, his unwillingness to just accept the story that is being presented, and the interpretations of the events that have happened. So we've got lots all the way through. Now, here, Lennox is talking about Macbeth. He has borne all things well. He suggests that Macbeth has done everything right, almost in a contrived way. It's all just a little bit too perfect. It all fits too perfectly. That Macbeth is almost planning his responses and playing a part. And so Lennox has seen through this veil that Macbeth has presented to cover over his guilt. Now, Lennox also suggests that Macbeth is quite barbaric and quite a terrible leader. He's quite vengeful. And he suggests that if Macbeth could get his hands on Malcolm, Donalbain and Fleance, he would kill them and pretend that it was punishment for their crimes, just like with Duncan's guards. So when he says, had he Duncan's sons under his key, they should find what it were to kill a father, so should Fleance. So Lennox is sort of drawing the connection here between the deaths that have happened after Duncan's murder, that actually Macbeth seems to be getting rid of all the people that might reveal his real involvement in Banquo and Duncan's deaths, that Macbeth is just killing anybody that's going to cause a problem. But he also prays that none of the sons ever find themselves in the company of Macbeth. And this tells us he's being sarcastic. He prays to God, he hopes to God, when he says, and it please heaven, he shall not. He hopes to God that Macbeth never gets his hands on them. That shows us that his support is with Malcolm, Donalbain and Fleance rather than with Macbeth. Now, Lennox introduces the discussion of Macduff at this point, and he talks about Macduff being in disgrace because he didn't attend the banquet. And the link here is that Macbeth seems to have defamed Macduff's character amongst the lords because Macduff didn't turn up. But what's most interesting here is that he stops referring to Macbeth by name, and here he calls him the tyrant for the first time, and it's noticeable that he feels comfortable doing so in the presence of another lord. So in the past we've seen people be very careful about who they say what to, but here Lennox speaks quite freely and talks about Macbeth as a tyrant. So that tells us that there's some unity amongst the lords against Macbeth, that they agree that he is not a good king. Now, the Lord fills in a little bit of detail about where Malcolm and Macduff have gone. And he says that Macduff has gone to the son of Duncan. He's gone to find Malcolm. And he tells us that they are in England. They're in the court of King Edward in England. And again, we've got a king here being described in really honourable terms. So Edward, the English king, is referred to as pious. So that means godly, sort of prayerful. And it's clear from the Lord's report that Edward doesn't believe that Malcolm killed Duncan. He has been welcomed into the English court as if he were the King of Scotland. And so he's getting on actually very well there in England, where people don't believe that he had anything to do with Duncan's death. And the Lord confirms that this is where Macduff has gone. And what makes this more important is that Macduff hasn't just gone to get Malcolm. He's trying to get King Edward and the English army to join with them to get rid of Macbeth. And so we've got this growing sense that justice is gathering and is going to be served on Macbeth. The whole of England is now working against him. So even with all his skill as a soldier, Macbeth's chances are not looking good at this point. And again, we've got holy kings. So we've had pious, now we've got holy, we had gracious Duncan. Notice that there are three kings in this scene. There's Duncan, there's Edward, and there's Macbeth, but only two of them get given any honour. That only two of them are described in a positive and honourable way. And it's almost like their lack of description of Macbeth tells us that they don't really recognise him as king anymore. So even though he's got the crown and he's got the throne and he has the role, the Lords of Scotland don't seem to recognise him in that role anymore. And we're going to see why in a moment. So the Lord is confident that God is going to assist them. So if the English army and Malcolm join with Macduff, they're going to have God on their side. And this is what confirms their attitude towards Macbeth. They don't think Macbeth is a legitimate king because God is going to work to help Macbeth's enemies get rid of him. And we know from our study, we're going to talk about this more in a minute, of the divine right of kings, what that means about Macbeth's role. He reflects on what it's like to live under Macbeth's rule. So the first thing he says is that they want meat back on their tables, and that tells us that there is not enough food to go round. There's no prosperity. There's some poverty in Scotland. He also says that they can't sleep at night. So there's no peace either. So we've got no prosperity and no peace. Then he talks about there being no trust, that at banquets and feasts there are bloody knives. People have got their daggers ready. They don't trust each other. There are spies everywhere. So there's no trust under Macbeth either. And there's also no respect. Faithful homage means showing due respect to people and authority, and there isn't any. These are all things that aren't present in Scotland at the moment. And there is also no loyalty. If you remember right at the beginning of the play, we talked about Duncan rewarding loyal subjects, and Macbeth is not doing that. And so there's no reason for anybody to be loyal to him. So there's no loyalty at all. So this is what characterises Macbeth's reign in Scotland. Remember that time has been condensed in this play. So he may well have been on the throne for 5, 6, 10 years even at this point, because it's about 30 years that are condensed into the time scale of this play. Now, they long for the old life under a legitimate and good king. The Lord says we pine for these things now. And you need to think back to Act 2, Scene 4. Macduff said that he was concerned that our new robes wouldn't sit as well as the old ones. The quote is there in the text box. He suggested that Macbeth would not be as good a king as Duncan, and that definitely seems to have come true as time's gone on. And the Lord says that Macbeth is so angry with Macduff that he is preparing for war. So war is brewing. We can see the tension building. The English army is gathering. Macduff is getting Malcolm, the rightful king. But Macbeth is also spoiling for war. And so all the tension is coming to boiling point, ready for the finale of this play. Now, this could be interpreted as quite dismissive of Macbeth. He says some attempt, and it's possible to interpret that as being quite sort of rude about Macbeth's skill. Remember, Macbeth is a trained soldier. He's really good at his job. But the suggestion here is that he's not capable of matching Macduff and Malcolm if they join together. So again, they're being really quite disrespectful of Macbeth at this point, which tells us what they think about him. Now, the Lord has heard rumours. Lennox clarifies that Macduff was actually invited to the banquet, and the Lord has heard rumours that Macduff was so open in his refusal that Macbeth resolved to take revenge immediately. This is not that Macduff just didn't get an invite or forgot, or the message got lost. Macduff openly refused, and the story goes that when Macbeth's messenger arrived at Macduff and told him that he was expected at the banquet, Macduff actually turned his back on the messenger and says, "Not me, I'm not going to go." And Macbeth's response was, "You'll rue the time that you gave this answer." So it was instant. It was instant wrath and anger from Macbeth. Now, as we approach the end of this scene, let's just look at the way Lennox finishes. He prays at the end of this scene for a swift end to Macbeth's reign of terror. He prays for some holy angel to fly to England, that a swift blessing may soon return to this our suffering country. So we get another perspective here of the state of Scotland. It's suffering. Macbeth's rule has brought suffering and harm on the nation, and the Lord agrees with that prayer. Now, this and Macduff's, Lennox's description of Macbeth's reign as them living under an accursed hand confirms that Macbeth isn't the rightful king. So we mentioned earlier the divine right of kings. This was the belief that God alone appointed kings, and he demonstrated his approval of them by bringing peace and prosperity to the land. Now, the lack of this in Scotland, as we saw through this section here, the lack of peace and prosperity shows that God is making it clear to all the people of Scotland that Macbeth is an illegitimate king. He's a usurper. We've used that word in previous tutorials. Remember Macbeth's words when he was preparing to kill Duncan. He said, "This Duncan has borne his faculty so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off." So Macbeth's concern, this is back in Act 1, Scene 7, Macbeth's concern was that Duncan was such a righteous, holy king that if he were to be murdered, every angel in heaven would make it clear that he had been murdered and the person taking his place had done it. And so this is what seems to have happened. God seems to be making it absolutely clear to all the people of Scotland that their king doesn't have the blessing of heaven. God didn't put Macbeth on the throne. Macbeth put himself there. So what's important in this scene? It's short, but it's really important. It's a really significant scene in sort of transitioning the play. We've seen that a lot in Act 3. We've seen lots of scenes that are bridging the gap between the first half of the play and the later scenes. It shows us that the attitude among Scotland's nobility has changed. They do not approve of Macbeth. They are against him. And Macbeth is openly called a tyrant and accursed by Lennox. So Lennox is really quite open about his sort of lack of faith in Macbeth. And the Scottish lords don't seem afraid of expressing their opinions about their king to each other, which means that there's some unity in Scotland against Macbeth as king. And they all now seem to believe that Macbeth killed Duncan and Banquo. So when Lennox relates all the events that have happened so far, he does it in a really sarcastic way that shows that he doesn't believe any of it. They recognise that Malcolm is innocent, and this is really important because the second half of the play is all about getting the rightful king back on the throne. And so it's really important in this middle act that we know that Malcolm is the rightful king, he's the legitimate heir, and that heaven is making that clear. It's also important to note that Macduff has gone to find him and is raising an army to get rid of Macbeth, and that Macbeth's reign is full of poverty, fear, and cruelty. So God is not with him. So this is all to help the audience cope with the overthrow of a king. Shakespeare's making it really clear to us that it's okay to get rid of Macbeth because he isn't the legitimate king, Malcolm is. And so rather than killing a king, rather than regicide, they're killing a usurper so that the rightful king can be replaced on the throne and that great chain of being can be put back into order. So what do I want you to do? Again, I want you to complete the scene frame on Act 3, Scene 6. And again, there's a paragraph here for you to write, how does this scene explore the belief in the divine right of kings? So I want both of these questions are about context. So on Scene 5, it's all about the idea of the play as a tragedy. This one, it's to do with the Jacobean worldview and their belief in the role of a king. And so this is an opportunity for you to practice making really clear links to the context of the play. Here's the scene frame, and I'll leave it on the screen while I sign off. So we've done a whistle stop tour of 2 scenes, and this means that we have finished Act 3. So we've covered more of the play than is yet to study. So there are only 3 scenes in Act 4, and they're quite meaty and chunky, so we'll get to those. And then we've just got the rush to the end of the play where Shakespeare does something really clever in Act 5. So I'm looking forward to going through that with you. I hope that's all made sense and is clear to you, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye.